Who all can tell you not to sing your story? Who all can tell you that you're singing off key? You are the dancer, you are not the dancer. You are the song, not the one who sang. Be a beautiful songbird. No, you tell the truth. You tell the truth. You tell the truth.
Welcome, everyone. This is Thrive with Morella. You've heard about mindfulness. For the past few years, mindfulness has been a little bit of a hot new trend. From retreats to corporate wellness, perhaps you've gone to a mindfulness meditation or a class. And with all of the information and hype surrounding mindfulness, how do you know that you actually have the best guide that can take you into the true depth of what mindfulness can provide? And as I sat with this question for our show today, what I thought I'd ask you is, have you ever thought about what is the goal of mindfulness? Is it just to quiet your mind? And if so, for what purpose? And what can you actually accomplish through the practice of mindfulness? And I find that the truth of that question is quite profound. And so today you're going to get a glimpse into that through my conversation with my guest, Mark Coleman. So Mark is the founder of the Mindfulness Institute. He has an MA in clinical psychology, and he has guided students on 5 continents as a corporate consultant, counselor, meditation teacher, and wilderness guide. And he's also the author of several books: Make Peace with Your Mind, Awake in the Wild, and his new book, which I had the pleasure of reading this weekend, which is From Suffering to Peace, The True Promise of Mindfulness. Mark, welcome to Thrive with Morella.
Thank you, Morella. Nice to be on your show.
I'm delighted to have you. So, Mark, to start off, I'd love to hear, what is one of your personal keys to thriving in life?
So one of my keys is I make sure that I go out into nature every day. So my love and passion is integrating mindfulness and nature. And because I think of nature as the most beautiful, easy, accessible way to become present, to become aware, to feel a sense of connection in the web of life. And so I make sure every day I have access to the natural world and bring that quality of attention, awareness, and mindfulness to it.
Thank you for starting us with that. You know, I think that Thrive with Morella, the one theme that there might be underscoring many of our episodes is that a lot of our guests start with that, nature, the connection to nature. And so,
Nice.
It's like, I will admit, I'm not necessarily the one who's going out to nature every day, and I would like to be. I look at nature every day. I'm privileged as to where I live, but I don't go out in nature. So thank you for that. So Mark, I adored your book. For one, my show is Thrive with Morella, Body, Mind, Heart, and Spirit. And you organize your book in kind of similar categories because you talk about mindfulness as applied to the body, mindfulness as applied to the mind, finding peace in the mind, and then mindfulness applied to equanimity and, finding peace in the heart, and then in the suffering that we find ourselves in often, and of course then mindfulness is applied to our life in the outside world. So it was such a perfect fit for me, and it was interesting to see what part of your book I was feeling very much drawn to. And so the majority of my questions today have to do more with the mind, and so, but we'll touch here on there. But you start your book off by mentioning some concerns you have about what you see in kind of the modern conversations around mindfulness, how it's become a trend. So can you share with us what are some of those concerns?
Yeah, so well, first, thank you for enjoying the book and reading the book. So, as mindfulness has exploded in the last few years, in a similar way to what yoga did, a few decades ago, my concern has been, and I'm very much part of, seeing that growth. I've taught in business and healthcare and education, the UN and various places, and there's tremendous goodness happening with that. But as anything grows as quickly as it does, and when the media picks something up and tells us it's the new thing, the new solution to every problem in life, then often the essence gets missed, or it gets simplified, it gets reduced to a good soundbite. And so mindfulness has often gotten reduced to attention or focus. Mm-hmm. And that's definitely a part of mindfulness. But mindfulness in its essence is really the cultivation of awareness, self-awareness, and a deep understanding of life, and really understanding what brings well-being, what allows us to thrive, in your words, mm-hmm. and what causes us to suffer and experience unnecessary pain. So really, mindfulness is embedded in this beautiful path of exploration, of understanding, of freedom. And so I was concerned, and I wanted to write about the full extent of the path rather than just it being simply focusing the mind.
And so what I found through reading your book was you truly, there's so many words coming to mind, but you truly expanded my understanding of mindfulness and helped me, and it's funny because I have a daily meditation practice and journaling practice and all of these different things. So there are elements of mindfulness that I do. But what I loved about your book was seeing how, as I was writing a blurb for the show today, what I found was your book is both incredibly profound, and it's also a really light read. It's you make it a very easy read, and you touch on so many different aspects of life. And so in the section that I really gravitated towards, the finding peace with the mind, you talk about so many different concepts, from judgment and I don't want to get ahead of myself, but in each section you touch on very practical applications of mindfulness that gave me a really wonderful view of just how broad and deep the practice can really take you. So one thing that I thought would be helpful for our audience to start with is in the chapter on page 82, in the chapter on working with the thinking mind, you present, in the practice, you mention your 3R technique, and of, observing thoughts and, the 3 R's. I can refresh your memory, but recognizing, releasing, and returning. And so I thought that was really nice, kind of crisp way of introducing a tool. So I was wondering if you could share with the audience what's this technique, the 3R technique, and how to use it.
Sure. Yeah. So this method is in context of a general meditation practice, and as any of your listeners have ever discovered when they meditate, that as lovely as meditation can be, and as beautiful as it's portrayed to be, it's often really one of struggling or being challenged by our minds that think and get distracted and wonder. And so the 3R practice is a simple way of learning to relate to thoughts, and at the same time learn to also abide in the present moment. And so in the beginning, what's helpful is to notice each time the attention wanders. That's the recognizing, where, oh, now I'm thinking. Okay, my intention was to meditate, but now I'm thinking about work. So we recognize that thought, we release it, we let it go. It's like, that's not what I'm doing right now. We can sometimes even add a note, not now, bookmark for later. And then we return the attention to the breath or whatever the focus is. And that is a practice that we do maybe hundreds of times in a single sitting. If you sit for 20, 30 minutes, you'll be returning your attention from its meanderings and wanderings countless times. And people think that's, I must be doing it wrong. I'm thinking, it's like, no, that's actually part of the mindfulness, part of training the attention to abide in the present moment.
Yes. And I loved that you have, here's the technique. It's 3 R's, recognize that you're having a thought, release it, return to the meditation, and how that is the essence of it. And then you present this kind of a step further, in different chapters, you talk about kind of labeling the thought, where in different parts you say, well, you can recognize whether you're planning or remembering or comparing or, kind of judging. So can you talk a little bit about the purpose of that kind of labeling, and how that is part of the mindfulness practice?
Yeah. Again, the principle being mindfulness is cultivation of awareness, which is helping us understand ourselves and our mind. And so the labeling is really just getting a little more crisp, a little more clear about, well, what are the habits of my mind? When I'm sitting and I'm daydreaming or meditating, where do I go? Do I go to the past? Am I reminiscing? Am I regretting? Am I trying to fix the past in some way? Or am I planning? Am I future oriented, judging, present moment? Am I rehearsing something? So the more that we get clear, which is what mindfulness does, reveals our mind, then it can be helpful to label, because when we label something, whether it's a thought or an emotion, it helps bring a little more awareness and understanding to it. And the more we understand these habits of whether we're planners or rememberers or rehearsers or judges, the sooner that we recognize, oh, there I go again in that long story about planning my vacation next week. And as soon as we recognize, oh, that's planning, it allows us to unhook, allows us to recognize, release, return. So, and it's also just food for self-awareness. Like, oh, where does my mind lean? Do I dwell? Am I really stuck in the past? Am I obsessing about a particular scenario that I can't seem to unhook? Mm-hmm. And so that information is really helpful in terms of working with our mind more effectively.
And in one part of the book, you even mention counting the number of times you have a particular thought or a particular kind of thought, whether it's judgment or, let's say, anxiety or, anxious thought, that if you start counting them, you say, by the time you get to 250 thoughts of the same kind by 10 a.m., you start to notice.
Right. Particularly with judging, because for many of us, and I see this as an epidemic, and my last book was about judging, we're often plagued by the critical mind. And sometimes it is literally hundreds and hundreds of judgments every day. And if we start counting them, it's like, by the time we get to 323, it's like, okay, please, enough already. Let's move on to actually getting on with my life and not listening to this negative critical mind.
Exactly. So there's one of the next chapters in the mind section, the chapter on the restless comparing mind, that is kind of related to the judgment, the judgment and comparison, kind of our siblings, right? And you say in this section that when we dig deeper, we find vulnerability underneath the restless comparing mind. So can you talk about that, the vulnerability underneath comparison? Because I don't think that's something we stop to really explore.
Right. Yeah. And I speak about vulnerability quite a bit in the book, because I do think mindfulness really helps reveal that we, as a human being, it's a vulnerable condition. We have a body that changes, it gets sick, we have loved ones who may get sick or lose things, so there's many challenges to being human. And the more that we can meet that vulnerability with awareness and kindness, the more skill we have. And this is particularly true with comparing. And as you say, the comparing mind is a sister of the judging mind. And they're both patterns of mind that really cause a lot of stress and unhappiness. And so, for example, say you're working in the office and there's a new hire in the team, and they happen to be young and successful and brilliant, and then we start comparing ourselves to them, and we might start trying to put them down, or we might feel threatened. Mm-hmm. And so the judging mind comes from basically sort of an insecurity in the ego that's always trying to find its place, whether it's better than, less than, the same as. And it's an inherently vulnerable condition, because conditions, people, situations are always changing, and it's hard for us to find, for the ego mind to find its ground. And the reason why comparing is so painful is because so often we don't see our own goodness, our strengths, our gifts, our qualities, and so we often negatively compare ourselves to others. Which is it's an innately vulnerable condition to be putting ourselves in that lesser position. So again, the point of mindfulness is revealing these patterns understanding them, seeing where they come from, and seeing how we can relate to them with kindness rather than judgment, and find a way to be a little more free from them.
Right. And would you say that underneath, the part of that vulnerability that's underlying the comparison and even the judgment, that there would be an element of fear in the
For sure, yeah. We're comparing ourselves, and if someone's better than us, if someone's smarter, more beautiful, more whatever, then of course it triggers the insecurity. We're very social creatures. We want to be loved and seen and accepted, and so if we live with any sense of scarcity or deficiency about ourselves, then of course we're going to be threatened by others. We're going to feel competitive. We're going to feel vulnerable or insecure, and so that's the vulnerability. Is feeling that's all very natural and also very tender. Mm-hmm. And so mindfulness both helps us develop a more accurate self-perception and also see those habits that often are spinning, that are really causing unnecessary grief.
Mm-hmm. And so there's so many ways in which we find ourselves in unnecessary grief because we're not paying attention. And so there's a chapter where you talk about dissatisfaction. In the chapter dealing with dissatisfaction, you say, by discerning how no experience can provide lasting satisfaction, we stop expecting that some experience might. And I loved that, because that's true of so many things. Like from a day to day, we can find that we might start to hook into things that we are wanting to have them last or stay the same, or
right.
Suffering because they're not the same. So can you talk about that? This teaching of how mindfulness can help us deal with the dissatisfaction of what's not lasting.
Yes. So I can give you two very recent examples. So one is, I'm very I have a little addiction to these Parmesan crisps, Parmesan chips.
Me
that
too.
Have suddenly become popular. They're salty, crunchy, fatty protein. It's like the perfect snack for me. I love salty, crunchy. And so I start eating them. This, fortunately, small bags, because I always devour the whole bag. And I start eating them because I love that crunchy, salty taste. And then after about, if I'm really honest, after about the 10th thing, it's like, it's okay. It's like, it's crunchy and salty, but it's not that initial delicious, salty, crunchy. Right. But I still keep eating because I'm thinking, well, it was working earlier. And if I keep eating, maybe I'll get that experience back. And then I finish the bag and that's ultimately quite unsatisfying because very fleeting. And and that's a simple example, but we do that a lot with food. We taste something, we love it. Our favorite food could be a strawberry, could be an ice cream, could be, who knows, lasagna. And sensory experience habituates, which means that the first experience is strong, the second strong, and then it weakens over time. And the reason why we start, pumping in the Parmesan chips is we're trying to re-stimulate that, get the same initial high.
Right.
And
oh, you're freezing for me a little bit.
Sensory experience has that sense of habituating. So another example, just coming from this retreat where it was both a heat wave and then it was freezing and then it was foggy. And, and then there's that sweet spot in between in California where it's like not too hot, not too cold. It lasts for about 10 minutes and then it's one or the other. And if I hold on to that or demand that or insist that life be like that, of course I'm not going to be happy because life is too interesting and changeable for that. So again, this is where mindfulness can help see these patterns, and it can be as simple as a Parmesan chip, or it can be very painful, like expecting a relationship to always be satisfactory, or expecting my job to always be satisfactory, or life to be satisfactory. And we know life is full of pleasure, pain, joy, sorrow, and it's really about how we relate to those changing experiences, not always wanting the pleasure that actually brings lasting happiness. And that's what the point of mindfulness is about.
Yeah, and the expectation that that it will stay the same. That if, this good thing, that whether it's taste or the excitement of a new job or a new relationship or even a party, that's great. The idea that it will stay the same, and that the pleasure, the whatever that high is will stay the same. It can change, but I loved how you brought that into the chapter of dissatisfaction.
And that particularly comes out of mindfulness helps us look at what the truth of experience, and one of the main truths of experience is it's changing. And we know intellectually things change and things can't possibly last forever, whether it's a high of a new romance, whatever, but we actually live like that. And so we get continually disappointed when things do change or, disappear. And again, that's where mindfulness supports us by saying, oh yeah, of course things change. Of course the high can't maintain itself. And the good news is nor will the low. We'll come out of the low in the hard times too, because things keep moving. And so we live more in harmony with reality rather than our ideas or wishes.
Right. And so this kind of connects with the next chapter that I would love to talk about, where, we're moving from the mindfulness of things changing to the chapter around letting go. And in this chapter, I typed up something that you wrote, and you said, as soon as we grasp something, it's as if we're strangling it. Letting go, and then later in that chapter, you say, letting go happens through the process of letting be. And so just as we're talking about, the dissatisfaction of wanting to retain that original, enjoyment, so much suffering in life comes from our attachment of how we want things to be or how we expect them to be. And it's such an important lesson for all of us to learn. So, moving from that conversation on dissatisfaction into this idea of letting go, can you talk to us about this practice of letting be in order to let go?
Right. Yeah. And again, going back to this retreat last week, so I'm teaching 40 people. It's a week-long retreat up in the woods in nature. And I, of course, as a teacher, want them to have the perfect conditions, the perfect experience. And, and then it's suddenly 95-degree heat wave, which I hadn't really tracked the weather. So I was surprised. And of course, there's nothing you can do. I mean, I guess we could have gone inside, but we chose not to. And one of the things that helped me find ease with that one was knowing it's going to change. Right, the hot weather never stays the same here in the Bay Area; it's always changing. In the same way, when it got really cold, was also noticing, oh, yes, it's going to change. It's pleasant in the moment, it's difficulty in the moment, and I know that my well-being comes not from having the perfect conditions, but from actually being able to meet the hot or the cold, noticing how my resistance, my reactivity, my judging, my complaining, all of that just compounds the difficulty. And so there's a certain kind of surrender that happens. So the letting go and letting be is, there are many conditions that we can change and we respond to, but there are many things that we can't, whether it's, maybe your body has some chronic pain, as mine does at times, or in this case, the weather. And so it's letting be, which means relaxing into, well, this heat is how it is, cold is how it is. And if I can do something great, take off a layer, put on a layer, great. And when I can't, that's when we practice the letting be, which eventually, letting be is a support for eventually letting go, which means letting go of our resistance and reactivity and struggle with life.
Right. Yeah, our struggle with life. I recently had an experience. I was in Ireland at the beginning of May, and I was just, enjoying my trip. I didn't have any plans. I was just writing and being, but the one thing I had planned was a riding excursion on Connemara ponies on the beach, and it was the one thing that I was looking forward to all week, and the night before it fell through. It wasn't going to happen, and I was so disappointed. And I found that I just said, well, maybe this is perfect, maybe. And so for me, that my words, when I was reading about your practice in letting be, the words that I've used is, what if I allow this to be perfect? What if this, in all of its imperfection, if I just let it be perfect? And then it ended up being perfect, and some magical things happened after that. But I like that idea of just letting what is, as opposed to what you said, we're not looking for perfection, for perfect weather, but we allowing what is to be perfect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a beautiful example. And then it's clear the problem isn't whether the pony ride happens or not. The problem is really how the mind, right, the heart deals with it. And if you can let be and let go, then it's okay. Of course, there are many harder things in life, right, than that, and or longer things. And and often the cliche, like I hear this a lot when someone say missing something or grieving something, and someone says, in sort of new age way, oh, well, just let go. It's like, well, I would if I could.
Right.
And of course we would let go if we could. And that's why the letting be, it's like, okay, well, since I can't let this grief go, and it's, it's healthy to grieve, then I need to be patient with kindness, understand it, see where the stickiness, maybe I have a reactivity to a certain politician or a certain colleague at work or to a certain part of my body, right? So the letting be is getting closer and understanding that. So then I can at some point release whatever that reactivity that's causing the problem.
Right. And you dive into, in the next section on finding peace in the heart, you dive into things, again, from vulnerability to awareness of triggering emotions to developing self-compassion, and then to what you were just mentioning as well, dealing with loss and grief. So I'm just noticing at time, we've got 2 or 3 more minutes with our guests on TV. We can stay on longer for the radio guests and the podcast, but maybe we can touch on some of these concepts of finding peace in the heart through mindfulness with things like loss. So can you talk about that?
Yeah. So I think what I talk about is in the mature practice, and someone who's developed these qualities for a while, the qualities of mindfulness and heartfulness or kindness come together, because so much of life is actually hard to bear, whether it's physical pain, loss of a loved one, being laid off at work, the climate crisis. There's a lot of painful things in life that are happening, and mindfulness is a support for meeting what's here, what's true. But if that is flavored or supported by kindness, by compassion, then we have much greater capacity. So if we're dealing with loss, or with, I went through a period in my life dealing with trauma and chronic fatigue, and I noticed how much more helpful it was when I could not just be aware of it, but also have some self-compassion, have some tenderness, some patience for the slowness of the fatigue to heal, some compassion for the trauma that was happening there. So when we can bring heartfulness into the awareness, then we have much greater capacity to hold whatever circumstances are happening in life.
Yeah. And be present to, as I read your book and in my own practice, I find that one of the most self-loving things we can do is to be present to our emotions, especially when we're going through those difficult times, whether it's grief or pain, physical pain or emotional pain, and just being able to bear witness to ourselves is a very self-loving thing.
Yeah.
So before we have to say goodbye to our television viewers, to our audience, I want to remind our viewers and those who might have just tuned in on the radio that my guest is Mark Coleman, and his most recent book is From Suffering to Peace: The True Promise of Mindfulness. It's available online, and if you want to learn more about Mark's work and Mark's other books, you can also find him online at markcoleman.org. And so for those of you who are watching on TV and you want to listen to the rest of my conversation with Mark, you can tune in to the radio 99.3 FM in Burlington, and also listen to the podcast on the Thrive with Morella website, thrivewithmorella.com, and listen to the podcast there, because I want to ask Mark about his experience of the dark night of the soul. There's some really profound things that you share there. And also, I want to ask you some questions about the applications to the outside world and how we can use mindfulness in our relationships and so forth. So you can continue listening to the conversation on the radio or later on the podcast. So Mark, you talk about your dark night of the soul, and I think this was one of my favorite parts in this whole section. And you share something that I have found to be true for myself. I'm also a counselor, I've been a hypnotherapist, and you say that through your experience, you found that moving through the dark night of the soul creates a fearlessness and a deep compassion that's expanded your ability to be present with your students and your clients. So for our audience, can you talk about the importance of allowing oneself to be fully taken into that depth of the dark night of the soul and what that all means?
Yeah. So, there's many times in life when, our circumstances get really painful, either inwardly or outwardly. For me, it was dealing with some early trauma that I hadn't really processed or understood, and it came up very powerfully during a retreat experience. And the joke I make in the book is, I wish it would just been a dark night, right? The dark night is really a long process of weeks, months, sometimes years, actually, and often years. And the trauma that I worked with ended up being quite challenging to work with, and I ended up getting chronic fatigue, and it was, really took me on a very different direction in my life in a way that was ultimately constructive. And so I'd been meditating for about a dozen years up to that point, with mindfulness, with loving kindness and compassion practices. And, but I was really surprised by the intensity of the pain that came up. And, but what was really beautiful to see was, as difficult as it was, that I could say pretty much the whole process during particularly the first year working with that stuff, that I was able to access and be able to stay mindful and kind or compassionate with myself. And that really was the lifesaver, because I was definitely feeling very raw states of fear, terror, annihilation, all kinds of other experiences, grief, loss. But because I was able to hold myself with a caring, loving attention, it was like I had someone holding me. And I often say that, we're often afraid of being abandoned, but we mostly, the person that abandons us the most is ourselves. We mostly leave ourselves when it gets hard, or we reject ourselves, or we judge ourselves. And so I just felt tremendous appreciation for having done a fair amount of practice prior to that I was able to bring that quality of awareness and kindness when I needed it, which was really when I was suffering greatly. And then the other thing that I take from that experience is, as much as we don't want to suffer and to feel pain and to feel these difficult states, go through the dark night, they're usually what transforms us the most. And for me, what came out of that was it really blew my heart open, and it really blew my heart open to compassion, self-compassion, and then therefore compassion for other people. And so, it's in the 20 years since that happened, I feel like I've been able to be a much more kind, compassionate, empathic person, because I know what it's like to walk in these really deep, dark, difficult states that humans go through.
Right. And that the tendency is, when things get so painful, that's a lot of times when people might look for ways to avoid feeling, to escape, to really not look at it. And then there might be a hardening, a numbing that happens, as opposed to what you're describing, the opening of the heart, where, you just find yourself in a far, far deeper place of compassion and understanding and love, and then a greater capacity to love and feel love and right? All of these things.
Right. And going back to our earlier conversation, what was really happening was, it was a profound letting be. right? I couldn't stop the pain from coming. I couldn't get rid of it. I couldn't run from it. So I was really letting it be. And in that letting be, over time, the letting go, the release happened over time through just meeting it moment by moment with a kind attention.
Right.
And that was a great lesson also.
Yeah. Thank you. So beautiful. And I know it was painful, but ends up being beautiful. So then in section 4 of the book, you move into the application of mindfulness towards our engagement with the world, our relationships, our service outward into the world, our sense of community and interconnectedness with all of life. But in particular, chapter 30 is about mindfulness in relationships. And you bring this practice, you present this practice of radical acceptance. Can you talk a little bit about radical acceptance and bringing mindfulness into your relationships?
Yeah. So, of course, I could have written a whole book on relationships because that's probably one of the places we most need mindfulness, because they're some of the most beautiful and challenging parts of our lives, right?
Yes.
Whether it's our children, our parents, our spouses, our friends, our colleagues, right? We got our buttons pushed and triggered. But I think this is particularly true in intimate relationship or in families. We so often don't want to meet what is. We want the person, in this case, to be different than they are, right? We want them to grow more. We want them to not do certain things. We want them to do certain things. And there's so many, and that's why relationships are such a crucible for transformation, because we're forced, we meet our preferences, desires, judgments, conditions, right? Conditions on our love. I'll love you if you do the dishes and pick up your socks and, give me a little more attention, or whatever the story is, right? And we're human, so we all have needs, wants, desires, preferences. But if we insist and demand that the person conform to our needs, wants, and desires, we're just setting ourselves up for suffering, because they're a human being with their own needs, wants, desires, and preferences. And so eventually, I think this is one of the lessons of a long-term relationship, we gradually grow into actually just letting the person be who they are and accepting them for who they are. Because as we look at ourselves and we know how hard and slow change is, and we think we can change someone else, and actually, one change has to come from within, and it's usually very slow. And ultimately, so much of peace and harmony comes in relationship when we can actually just allow someone to be as they are, with all of their weird, wacky, idiosyncratic selves, just like we're weird and idiosyncratic. We just don't see that we're the ones that we have the same thing.
Right.
And so I found it very, very helpful to actually, really a deep expression of friendship with anyone, whether it's our spouse or family or friends, is actually really allowing them and celebrating for who they are, with their differences and their, different perspectives and things. And that takes practice.
Yeah. Well, and that if we take this piece of mindfulness in allowing them to be who they are in exactly the way they're showing up, and instead then go back to the other sections in your book where there's triggering emotions, or there's, beliefs, or there, whatever it is, then you could potentially, it's funny, because just last week, I'm reading your book and I'm seeing places where I was last week that are like, oh, I did not do this. and then look back and, not look back, if you can stop in the moment and notice, oh, there's something here that is getting activated in me for whatever reason. This person is doing something, saying something, not doing something, and I'm getting activated. And if we have the presence of mind, the mindful, to stop and, tune in. What is that feeling? What's the thought? What's the belief? Where's this coming from? Our response would be so different. And I wish last week, I had been there. I was not, but I was reading your book thinking, oh yeah, I missed that one. So, right, that you would then bring it full circle.
Right. Yeah, I was, I'm not sure if I shared this story in the book where I think I did, I'm listening my partner sits me down and wants to have a conversation about some stuff around the house, and I'm like, okay, here we go. One of those domestic, sort of irreconcilable challenges.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting and like, okay, and I'm like, I'm listening, and I'm like, okay, Mark, this is a trigger. I know I'm going to get triggered. I know I'm going to get defensive about not, pulling my weight around the house. I'm like, breathe, feel my feet on the couch, on the floor, breathe. And she's talking. I'm like, I'm like all my arguments and defenses, and and at some point after like 10 minutes, I'm like, she's kind of right. I think she's got a fair point of view. And if I just gotten triggered, which you can do pretty easily, and gotten into an argument, that could have been a whole unnecessary lot of suffering for both of us. And so it was really great practice to go, oh, right, these practices really work in the heat of the moment, which is often where we need them.
Yeah. We could probably just end it at that and let people take that one away because it applies to all of us every day in our relationships. But anyway, I totally skipped over the first section of the book. I read it, but I just felt like there was so much richness in all of these other parts. But you do spend, essentially a quarter of your book talking about the application of mindfulness in the body, in being consciously embodied, in dealing with pain and aging, and even facing death. I mean, these are really significant things. I was just feeling drawn to talk more about the other stuff. So can you share with us a little bit about, the practice, the benefits, the gifts of mindfulness as applied to, being in our bodies?
Yeah. Well, I start with that book because mindfulness does start with the body. We tend to be very, head-centered, mental, thinking types for the most part. And, especially with technology and screen time, we're less and less, we're sitting at desk, we're less in our bodies, less feeling our bodies. And mindfulness is, if anything, an in the body practice. We think of meditation often as floating, transcending, blissing out, but actually mindfulness is about sitting in your body, feeling, sensing your experience, sensing your breath, opening to your senses, particularly like the work I do in nature, and learning how to be present to the physical reality of having a body. And the body is an amazing, mysterious thing, just miraculous in its senses and its healing and its sensitivity. And so mindfulness just helps us become present to our physical experience, present to our breath, and then present to the whole wealth of information that whether it's our emotional life or our intuition or just, there's so much wisdom that we can learn from the body if we pay attention. Mm-hmm. And if we are paying attention and our awareness is settled in our body, we can also move through the world connected, grounded, centered, embodied. And so mindfulness goes with us wherever our body goes because they're one and the same. So it's a great support for life and for the mindfulness practice.
And it is in the body that we feel triggered, that we feel our emotions, that we feel the, anxiety. So, I skipped over it because I wanted to get to these other things, but you're absolutely right to start with the body because that is where we are aware, where we perceive our awareness.
Right. Like right now, as your listeners are listening, like, are you aware of your body? Can you notice your posture? Can you notice your feet on the ground? Can you notice your breath? Can you notice how these words are landing? And if you're agreeing or disagreeing, can you notice all of that in the body? It's giving us great information about ourselves, about our response to each other, about reactions to life. But it takes a little training to turn the attention inward, which is why meditation is such a great support.
Yeah. Mark, this has been so wonderful. I have just one final, very simple question for you, and then, ask you if there's anything that we haven't touched on. But my last little question for you is, what does your daily practice look like?
So depends on where I am, because I'm often teaching. So if I'm teaching, it's usually outside. My daily practice would be, sort of a 30-minute meditation, either indoors or often outdoors, either on my balcony or my garden. And it's my practice at this point, after I've been meditating 35 years, is simply learning to it's actually what I call a non-doing practice. It's simply being with the flow of experience, with awareness, and just being present to how awareness reveals our moment-to-moment experience. So it's very relaxed, open, without a particular objective, except to abide in this knowing quality of awareness that comes from mindfulness.
I love it.
And in terms of one
oh, you just froze. I'm gonna see if I can get you back. There you are. Okay, so were you going into the last thing we haven't mentioned, or?
Yes.
Okay, you skipped for a minute, so go ahead.
Okay, so yes, I was just saying the last piece of the book, which we talked about going into, was about nature. And since much of my work is about teaching people how to bring mindfulness in nature, and since you live in a beautiful state, and many of your listeners might, and it's summertime, nature is a wonderful, wonderful, easy, accessible way to be mindful, right? We go out for a walk, we go to the beach, we walk in the woods. And what happens, we naturally pay attention. We pay attention to the bird song and the beauty and the trees and the light and the waves and the forest floor and the smells. And so really want to invite your listeners to see how going out into nature naturally brings us to attention, especially if we're not wearing our buds and we're not talking and we're not trying to beat our best time on our mountain bike or whatever. And we're just actually going for a quiet walk by ourselves or with a friend, but in silence for a while. Or sitting by a lake or in a park or in our garden, and actually just noticing how all the senses, the hearing, seeing, smelling, touching, particularly, how those senses really allow us to come into the present. And so we can use nature, our time in nature, to really develop this very natural, effortless, mindful presence, which is really what it's all about ultimately, is learning to abide in this natural, mindful presence.
Beautiful. Mark, thank you so much for our audience. I just want to remind everyone that my guest today has been Mark Coleman, 20-plus year mindfulness teacher. You can find all of his work and his books on markcoleman.org. And his latest book is this one right here, From Suffering to Peace, The True Promise of Mindfulness. As I said at the beginning, it's a profound book, but it's such an easy read, really, really wonderful, light, and also so practical, because in every single chapter you have a suggested practice, a little bit of you can read it and follow that kind of mindfulness or meditation practice. And I thought was really, really wonderful. So Mark, thank you so much for joining me on the show today.
Thank you, Marilla. It's been a pleasure.
A true delight. So we are going to stop YouTube, end the stream before we get into trouble for playing music that we're not supposed